Welcome USA Today bestselling author Lauren Smith. Yay!
Thank you for having me.
Well, I'm so thrilled to have you on, Lauren, because I know you've written a bunch of books and I can't wait to talk to you all about it. So in case listeners don't know, can you tell them a little bit about yourself and your writing?
Sure. I'm a retired attorney and I write full time and I live in Oklahoma. So I'm an Okie from Muskogee, although technically I live in Tulsa. And I didn't know I wanted to write romance until I was in law school, but I should have figured it out because when I was watching the movie Titanic when I was 11, I was completely obsessed with rewriting the entire story just to make sure Jack didn't die. And I should have figured out that it was a romance novelist waiting to happen.
How interesting is it that like you didn't kind of find your love of romance writing or that you wanted to write a romance till later? Because I'm hearing that more and more is that especially within the last couple of years, a lot of people who didn't think they wanted to write romance kind of dove headfirst into it like in their 30s or 40s as they've gotten older. I think that's actually pretty nice that you kind of wait till you're a little older because then I think you have like a better understanding of romance.
I think that's true. And I think too, there's like for me, I grew up with a grandmother that loved romance, and I had a mother that didn't like romance simply because my grandmother liked it. And yet my mom had never read it. So I'd been raised to think that it was just not, I hate to use the word smut, but she would call it that. She doesn't now. She fully is invested in it now and loves all my books and reads them and edits them and everything. So we've converted her. No worries there. Like everyone, no one hate on my mom. She's wonderful. I think it's just that there's this assumption that it's not good writing, it's not good stories, it's not well researched. And none of that's true. Like, I mean, there are stories out there that may not be written as well or researched as well, but the average romance writer, all we do is add love into a really good story. And I think people don't realize that until they're older. And then something that they come across on the shelf catches their attention, like 50 Shades of Grey or, something like that. So for me, I think I was lucky I didn't find it until later. And I say that because I read everything but romance until I was in, my mid 20s. So when I came to romance as a writer, my style is a little different. It's still fast paced. It's still catchy. It's still, sexy and fun, but I have what like my readers called like a Lauren version of things. So there's this richness to it. There's historical things that are brought in, or there's these fantastical or magical elements that even if it's a normal book, there's just this different lush feel to it because I have all these different genres that have influenced my personal writing voice over the years as I was writing and growing up and exploring who I was as just a storyteller. So my books are in a way kind of really fun because they're like everything plus the romance in it, which is kind of magical. So
Oh, I love that because that's the exact same reason that I kind of cross genres when I like talk to different writers is I'll talk to like a horror writer or a cozy mystery writer or a women's fiction writer is because I feel like there are different types of writing that we can still learn from and we can kind of
exactly.
integrate into our own writing because I love doing that. And I love reading even outside of the romance genre a lot of times just because it gives me, like you said, more well-roundedness of like, I like that they did this in the story. Like
Exactly.
I'll be honest, I'm kind of like obsessed right now with The Last of Us. Like I work in the video game industry anyway, but I've been watching it quite a bit just because I'm just like they did it really well. I want to figure out how those writers did it so well, you know?
My brother's in the film industry and I remember when that video game first came out, he reads sometimes and he's a good reader, but he just has a business where he's really distracted a lot. So his downtime occasionally is playing just the occasional game. He's not a huge gamer, but I remember he distinctly said to me, there's this amazing game that I'm playing, The Last of Us, and the story is incredible. And I remember thinking, I never really thought about video games and stories, but like now it's a real thing. Like really good games have really good stories. And so I was really excited when I heard it was coming out of the show because I'm not a gamer so much. I just don't have time to play video games. But I thought, now I can watch the show.
And they have changed some things, but like that's, I think, what makes those really, like you said, like some of those stories stand the test of time. It's just, they're just so good, right? Even
Right.
like the Jane Austen, that's why they're still hanging around when we say Pride and Prejudice. Everyone knows what that book is, even if they haven't read it. So there's
Right.
something so essential about that. So we kind of chatted about it really quickly before we jumped on to record. But so you've been publishing romance just since about 2012 with titles spanning like multiple subgenres like historical, like paranormal, contemporary, time travel, etc. When you first started writing, did you think you were going to write across several romance subgenres?
I actually did. And I remember talking to older authors, and older by means just been in the industry longer. And I remember saying, hearing that they told me this is going to be more difficult. You're going to have a harder time branding yourself and reaching people because some readers don't like to cross genres. Other readers are amazing. They'll follow you anywhere, read a grocery list. I had someone told me once that she'd read a grocery list I wrote. I thought, that's really sweet. I wouldn't want to read my grocery list, but I love that you do. So I remember thinking it would be a challenge, but I also knew that even though I want to make money and want to have a business and be able to provide for my family and that sort of thing, as any person does who writes for a career, I also really respect my craft, and I really respect the stories because I believe certain stories, especially that I write, have a powerful meaning for society, and maybe they're just a really good way to relax readers. And I just feel that I always have to follow what the story should be. And so if one day I'm writing Regency Dukes and then the next month I'm thinking dragons, then I go with dragons because that's what my muse is telling me. So and it's funny how that can go. I literally came up with a dragon trilogy based off of like a one-liner I threw in a novella about like dragons being obsessed with virgins, and my editor was like, okay, I like this novella, but can we do the dragons first as a big trilogy with full-length books? And I went, really? She goes, yeah, that one line hooked me. And I went, okay, sure. So I wrote a whole series around one line that I just kind of threw in as a funny joke for myself in my paranormal universe. So I always just try to follow what I think would make a good story. And I think that's why that my readers have called it like the Lauren version of things, like the Lauren Tarzan, the Lauren, so it's just kind of all over the place, but it's fun that way because they always know no matter what genre they're picking up, my style and voice will pretty much be the same. How I approach characters, how I approach pacing. My style doesn't change across the genres. It's just literally the content that changes. So you might be reading Dukes in one book and Dragons in the other, but they're both going to feel the same as a reading experience.
Well, and that's so interesting that you say that because when I had mentioned that, a lot of authors right now are like, that's like the whole branding gig, right? Is that you write one subgenre. And like that's kind of what you stick to. I kind of like that you branched out and you're just like, but I want to write all the stories.
And
And you
I did create two pen names, and I kind of wish I didn't. I mean, I'm on the fence about it. My other pen name is Emma Castle. It's still romances, but it tends to be a bit darker. And I knew that there were readers from my normal group that you always worry about upsetting somebody. And so I thought, well, if I've got some, kind of a little more questionable plot lines, I thought, man, maybe I'll put a pen name on it. But then after COVID happened, to kind of give everybody a boost, I was like, surprise, I'm both people. They're still saying separate names, but I'm both people. So everybody knew. So I kind of do a few stories on the side on that. And then I do have cozy mysteries under a different name, strictly because cozies aren't heavy on the romance and the readers get very upset if there's too much kissing or anything like that. So I had to have a separate name for that. But it's a lot of work. And I think that's part of it is I like having everything under Lauren because for the most part, because I don't run myself ragged with 20 social media accounts under, a million different names and have a bunch of different websites. I mean, I already do that with the 3 pen names as it is, and it's a lot. So I couldn't imagine having every subgenre be a different name. That would be exhausting.
Well, and that's why I felt like it was so important to talk to you about this because I know that that's a lot of questions I'm hearing from authors within the romance community in particular is like, hey, I want to write a paranormal, but I also want to write like a historical romance. How should I put them under a different name? And I know, like I said, that's kind of I'm seeing somewhat of a shift in that. But like you said, you rather spend your time writing than actually having to manage like all the social medias, all the websites. I didn't even see Emma Castle in your website when I was double checking.
I just sort of told people on social media, I'm like, by the way, I'm the same.
Because that's the only reason I know sometimes that people go under other pen names is because I'll check their website and I'm a casual romance reader because there's just so many out there. So I'm always like looking for something new and I'll be looking and I see like, oh, they have a whole different series under a totally different name. And it just happens to be on their website. And I'm just like, okay, cool. So, I mean, and you have so many great series to dive into that are ongoing or that you started. Several of them involve like timelines. Lord bless you, because that's like always something that trips me up, like history or multiple characters. How do you keep track of individual series or books?
It's not easy. I wish I could say I was like amazingly organized and had all these glorious spreadsheets. It's literally like I'm so old school. When I write a book, I write everything by hand and then I dictate it and then fix the typos and then off it goes, because the writing with your physical hand stimulates your right brain. So when I start to write a book, I just do a basic character sheet: heroine, hero, age, hair color, eye color, basic facts about them. Like, do I need to know their parents' names? Do I need to know if they have titles, or what their gig is essentially for the story? And then I just kind of spitball off of that. And then if I need to check anything from a previous book, like let's say I have a guy coming in from a cameo from a previous book, I'm like, where are his eyes again? Oh, go pop into that manuscript real quick and do like a search for eyes. I mean, it sounds so silly, but a lot of it too is that, like, it, when people are like, how do you keep everything straight? I'm like, well, think about how many TV series that you watch. You watch a lot of TV series. You would not confuse Friends with the X-Files, but if you watched both, you could easily follow both. So in my head, when I'm writing a paranormal versus writing a Regency, I can keep those two pretty separate pretty easily at the same time. And I keep all their worlds and everything separate, because it's just like following TV shows or movies. I mean, it's like and I jokingly say that everything technically takes place in the same universe. I leave Easter eggs across my various subgenres. So you might see two dragons hanging out in a gentleman's club in like modern London. And I mean gentleman's club like a rich dudes who drink scotch in a bar, not like a exotic dancer club. But they might see a portrait of a guy from Regency England on the wall, and you'll realize that's one of the guys from my Regency series. They're like, oh yeah, we used to know him 200 years ago. So it's kind of like this running joke that if you read everything, you'll see these little things that sort of tie everything together. But at the same time, you can fully separate those worlds when you're reading, just as a reader, and not get confused. I think the only time I've ever gotten messed up was when I was trying to write two historicals back to back. And I usually don't like to do that. I usually like to write one thing and then jump to the next type of subgenre and kind of rotate it. It keeps me fresh. It keeps me inspired. And I don't feel like I'm writing the same thing over and over, because I notice if I write two things in a row of the same genre, they feel too much the same, both in plot, both in characters. And I feel like my brain maybe isn't finished with the story if it thinks I'm still writing the same genre. And I think that's like a weird little trip. So if I completely switch genres, then my brain like reboots and goes, new story, new ideas, new characters, and it changes everything and keeps it fresh.
I feel like that's where the lawyer sensibilities might even come into play, right? Because I know as a lawyer, you got to know, because I've worked with legal before, and I know you guys got to know like a ton of like all these like addendums, or like all these like little pieces of the like laws that I'm just like, I did not read that fine print. I'm so sorry. I got like the basics and that was it. And so like I feel like all those like tucking away, like you might have even conditioned yourself to tuck away all those like nuggets and all those little details to keep it straight.
Oh yeah. And the ability to juggle, like, people always say like, why is it so many lawyers or writers? And I'm like, I think it's because we're just used to juggling a lot of things and getting a lot of work done. I mean, it's programmed into our job. And so you're trained to be able to be hyper focused and to handle 20 things at once. And so it kind of does make you good for writing if you have a creative side. So
if you're a lawyer, you might actually be a good writer too, depending.
Yes, I really do believe that, because I mean, I remember one time I got hired by an attorney, and he specifically did not have a problem with my fiction side of my life, because he said, well, you're actually suited to be a better brief writer than anybody, because you understand how to craft a story and how to craft a narrative. He goes, that's all brief writing is. He goes, when we're crafting the narrative, we're influencing somebody to our side of the story. He goes, you're not lying or, making anything up, but if you're saying things and you're presenting it in a certain way and manipulating the language to get across a certain storyline, that's what all writers do. That's what you want in briefs. And I was like, he's absolutely right. This is a superpower for lawyers. So it goes both ways.
Kind of like we mentioned, since your books come out, like I saw that they come out back to back pretty quickly, and you talked about hyper focusing into them. I assume you're a pretty fast writer.
I'm a fast writer to a degree. Like it's so interesting. I always hear other writers say, oh, I wrote 10,000 words in a day, or I wrote a book in a week. And I'm like, well, I don't do that, but I tend to hit 25,000 to 3,000 words a day. And when I'm in consistent writing mode, which for the first time in 8 years, I'm actually taking it easy right now, just for mental health sake, because we had a family member that had cancer. So we were dialing everything back, and now we're just sort of resting after going through that, and that person's getting better. But it's just one of those things where I thought I need to just slow down a bit because I did 75 books off over 3 pen names in 8 years, and that was a lot. One year I released 11 stories. They weren't all full length, but that was 11 stories in one year, and that was tough. But I think the thing was, is I wrote every day. I mean, you eat Christmas Day, Thanksgiving Day. I mean, your weekends, I worked and I would work all night. And, I mean, like last night I was up till 11:30 and I'm up at, 6 and I work all day. And, so it's one of those things where I think if you just put in the hours, and as a lawyer, you're used to sitting and putting in the hours, then it just adds up and you get a lot done. So it's kind of that simple.
I like, though, that you took the time. You recognized that you probably needed some kind of mental health break, at least from because that is a lot to take on. Oh my gosh, 75 books in
8 years. Yeah.
8 years.
But still,
I mean, that's still a lot, though. That is still quite a bit. Like, I mean, I see I know writers I talk to will be like, yeah, I'm lucky if I can get 4 to 5 books out in a year, and I'm just like, man, that's a lot to me. I mean, that seems like a lot, but
that is a lot. I mean, yeah, for the average writer, that is a lot. I mean, that's a lot for me now. I'm like, that's probably how I'm going to do maybe 4 books this year, and that'll be enough.
But you've already got like a big catalog out there too for people to catch up on, if they want to dive head first into a Lauren Smith novel, and then you got 2 other pen names on top of that, so that they can add that onto their list. So, since you do write fast, do you allow yourself research for a book since you kind of dabble in several subgenres?
So I always chuckle at that because a lot of people ask, and I think they expect writers to sit there and like do months of research and all this kind of dramatic stuff. And I was a history major that had to write, on average 5 research papers a semester on 5 different topics that each had to be 20 to 40 pages, double spaced, where I'd have to consume for research purposes maybe 10 to 15 different primary and secondary resources. And if anybody's ever read history books from college, they're very dry. I mean, they're interesting, but they're dry. And so to be able to read through and process information quickly and prioritize what's good and what's not to use is, again, a superpower that I developed in college because I was a double major in history and political science. So every single semester was double papers on both ends. And so I got really quick on just reading these texts and stuff. So what I tend to do is probably not the best, but I have a vague idea of what my idea may be for research purposes. And then I will spend, if I can, 1 to 2 days reading up on anything I need to know if I have articles or I have workshop lessons, because I take a lot of workshops in my spare time. Like, even if I don't read everything, the few months that I'm taking that workshop, I'll save the lessons, as PDFs and then read them when it's time. So, for example, I'm getting ready to write a story where a guy was falsely accused of stealing goods from a river barge in the Thames in England in the 1800s. And he's going to be imprisoned and transported for the crime. And I don't really know a lot about the legal system in Regency England. And I had taken 2 workshops. So right now I'm spending like 2 days back to back doing nothing but reading about 200 pages of workshop material just for this crime and punishment section, so I can understand what I need to know for the legal system to properly write this intro of the story. And then the rest of the story, it won't matter. I have all my normal research that I've already sort of internalized, like what types of conveyances people, when I write a lot in Regency, I get very comfortable and you memorize what kind of clothing they have, the colors, the foods, the places, the mannerisms. So you don't always have to look that stuff up anymore. But when I was writing my World War II book that I did recently, I was reading and working at the same time. So I was researching books while writing the actual novel at the same time. And it took me start to finish almost 2 years to do that. I wrote 3 other long books at the same time. I was doing this one historical fiction book. It took a lot longer than normal because it was not somewhere I was familiar with, but it was a time period where I knew I had to get so many small details right that it took longer than normal. So it was different than my usual process. So it was very interesting to switch and I'd be like, whoa, this is a lot more work than I usually do. And I was like aware of it.
Well, that's super interesting. And I feel validated because I do the same thing. Like I will come across like some information that I'm like, that would be great for like the paranormal romance I want to write later or a historical romance. And then I'll just bookmark it and I'll be like, I don't need it now, but I might need it in the future.
Exactly. Yeah.
So like but I like that you kind of segment some time away for research specifically, because I know that's kind of halted my writing process. And like our mutual friend Chrissy, like I remember we went on a retreat once and Chrissy's like, I'm spending like 2 hours looking like what kind of underwear they wore in Scottish like medieval times.
Right.
Like she like fell into this like rabbit hole of
Oh
research.
yeah.
And I was just like, girl, just highlight it, move on. Like, cause you don't want it to interrupt your writing. I was like, just kind of highlight it and come back to it later when you put like time away for research. Cause I feel like if I do try to research while I'm writing, it's always just a mixture of like, look at this shiny thing and go
Oh
like
yeah.
run away from it, run away from the writing when it can be really productive. So,
Exactly. Yeah. If it's not integral to the scene, like underwear is a small thing that can be changed.
yes.
If you're not needing to know where they're going or what, something bigger in the plot, yeah, that's definitely the best way to do it. Like how you said, just mark it and move on.
Exactly, exactly. And I'm trying to get better about that too, because I'm just like, I don't need to like whatever I do not go to Google, stay away from Google just for like a little bit of time so I can like focus on writing because
Yeah.
otherwise it's just disaster for me. So I know we kind of mentioned it a little earlier when we were talking about like branding yourself under like a specific subgenre, and you had said that a couple of other authors had kind of mentioned, no, you kind of want to keep it to one subgenre, or you may not want to funnel everything at least right under like one name. So was it ever an option? Like I know you said you got two other uh pen names. So did that come later or did you kind of do that at the same time you kind of started writing?
The two pen names definitely came later.
Hmm.
Emma Castle was started around 2018, so 4 years into my career, and then Daphne Hunt only showed up, I think, in 2019. COVID has made my brain forget when I started certain things. I'm like, that was the COVID year, so add two, right? Subtract one, divide by four. So, but I think I was more aware of the conscious decision of, okay, for sure need a different pen name for the cozy, and it needs its whole branding to be different because these are mysteries about young women off with cats helping them solve murder mysteries or something. So it's a completely different audience than my normal audience. And then Emma Castle, I remember thinking, okay, I'm probably never going to do any historicals for Emma, but I'm going to stick to contemporaries and maybe some paranormals and then fairy tale retellings that are set kind of in maybe modern day. So I've limited Emma a little more than I've limited Lauren. And the premise that ties everything in Emma Castle books together is that it's a little darker, a little edgier. You have a girl who falls in love with the actual devil, or you have like my Tarzan retelling wasn't actually that dark, but it was more just kind of edgy in that it was sort of really modeled off the original Edgar Rice Burroughs storyline, and it wasn't as sexy as you'd expect, but it was really emotional and true to what the Tarzan characters were and that whole thing. So it was kind of edgy in concept rather than edgy in romance.
Mm.
But I just as kind of decided my rules are a lot more fluid. But I think the people that have made the conscious decision to zero in on one subgenre and then really drill down on it and focus, they do find their readers easier and they do make more sales. However, 10 to 15 years down the line, I've heard those same authors go, I'm so tired of writing this thing. I'm burned out. I got to switch. But I'm zeroed in. So now I got to start a new pen name to write something totally different. So that's where I'm glad that I'm like, oh, I can just switch whenever I want. And feel kind of crazy about it at the same time. But I know that I don't have as easy a time, finding and targeting fans. And it does mess up sales on Amazon because the also bought section will have 5 different subgenres in the bottom and it can confuse people. So it does make it a little harder for advertising purposes for sure to be spread out.
I do love the point though that you bring up because I'm kind of the same way. I kind of read everything. So I kind of want to write like everything.
Follow the muse. That's most important.
Yes, absolutely. And I think you're right. There is something to be said about audience expectations. When you write a certain subgenre, people kind of, and you kind of brand yourself around it, people kind of expect that specific subgenre. And I think if you get tired, I mean, that's great. If you can write that subgenre all day long and like keep going with it, That's awesome. I applaud authors that can do that.
Right.
I love variety. So like I'll read like a monster, like right now I'm finishing up a monster romance and I'll probably dive headfirst into a historical romance. And then I'll probably go from there to a contemporary. And like I just kind of like go around everywhere to any other genre. And that's kind of how I want to write too. So I kind of
Yeah.
love that you kind of put everything under one big umbrella of your brand. And when you did kind of siphon it off into different pen names, there's a specific reason. Like you said, the Emma is a
Yeah.
little darker and Daphne Hunt for Cozy Mysteries. And like you said, I just did an episode with a friend for Cozy Mysteries, and she kind of broke it down the differences between romance and Cozy Mysteries. And they
Oh
are
yeah.
wildly different
Oh
from
yeah.
like the reader expectations. And you have to meet those reader expectations or else readers get mad.
But I love romance readers because they appreciate that as long as there's love somewhere in the story, they go with any plot that you throw at them. Whereas some of the other genres, it's like if it doesn't fall in these specific hardline rules, then they're angry forever. And I'm like, why would you be angry? I'm giving you something slightly different.
That's very true. Yeah, romance readers like they kind of like there's a suspension of disbelief and they just kind of roll with it. They're
Yeah,
just like,
they're like on the
yeah,
frontier. They're like, we're ready to try anything. And I love that attitude about them so much.
I do. I applaud them a lot. And I do, I have talked to several people who have been like in kind of worked with several romance authors or been in the publishing industry. And a lot of times they tell me, yeah, romance readers are leading the way for a lot of like trends and shifts
Oh
and
yeah.
things.
Oh yeah. They're on the forefront of everything. Yeah.
Exactly. And like we just don't get enough credit. So I always applaud romance readers for being like awesome
Me
in
too.
that way. So, what do you do when an idea of a new subgenre series comes to mind? I know we briefly mentioned it when you had like the one line of like the dragons in your other books and it kind of spiraled. Would that process look any different from the other subgenres?
A lot of times if I haven't read anything in that genre before, like if I'd never read a dragon shifter, I might go buy a couple dragon shifter books that look good to me because I want to see, okay, what are readers responding to? So it's not that I want to copy or mimic those artists, but I want to see how are they structuring the world building, how much of the world building is going into this, how are they hitting the emotional notes. So I just kind of want to see what the story feels like because people think of romance as formulaic and romance is not formulaic. Good storytelling of any kind of genre follows a distinctive path that we as humans expect stories to feel like. So when you think about a book that has a cliffhanger ending and there's no book that comes after it and you never know what happens, you're naturally physically upset about it. And that's because we're programmed from our days in the old caves with Neanderthals coming back from the hunt. We are programmed to hear a story and to have a conclusion. It may not be a happy conclusion, but we need to feel like we've finished the story. And so bad storytelling doesn't satisfy that proper arc. And that arc can have many variations along the way per the genre, per the requirements of whatever. But I hate the word formula because it's not a formula, it's a pattern. And patterns are positive to me. Patterns, we are comforted by patterns. Patterns keep our survival. That's how humans have survived. Storytelling became a way for us to warn each other, to teach, to educate, and then to entertain eventually. So when I approach a new book, I think, okay, what's the pattern? What are reader expectations? I'm going to do my version of it, but I just want to make sure that if I'm writing vampires, I'm not going to go write vampires in space. I'm going to think, okay, Dracula's popular for a reason. What is it about Dracula that everybody likes with vampires? Okay, it's the seductiveness, it's the Victorian goth lush environments, it's the ideas of coffins and stakes and old world dirt holding power. And so I'm kind of thinking, okay, how do I play that into a modern story? How do I, and so I just try to think, what is it that attracts it? So my vampire books you wouldn't read them and think this is just like Bram Stoker. Instead, you're just going to go, this is an interesting, good vampire story because it goes with what people are expecting, but at the same time, it's fresh and different. So that's kind of the balance you want to strike is it needs to be fresh and different enough. And the best way you can do that is having really, really strong characters. So I always focus on character over plot ingenuity because I think a lot of readers or writers, especially when they're starting out, they make the mistake of focusing on, oh, this is a totally new concept nobody's ever done before. But then you read the book and you think, I didn't bond with any of these characters and I don't care what happened at the end because they spent too much time focusing on this magical, sparkly idea and they didn't give you what the reader really wanted, which is at the end of the day to root for somebody and to care and empathize with a character and understand them and care about what happens to them. So I always think, okay, that's the Lauren version. I'm like, I'm going to write this thing and make it my version of this thing and make the readers care, and yet they're still going to get what they want out of a typical dragon or vampire or historical romance.
No, and that is awesome because that's what I do love about like reading romance in particular is a lot of times like there's great characters who want to like who you do want to root for, like you said. And I have read a lot of romance where sometimes the writer will bring up a plot point, and you can usually tell where the newbie writers are because you'll hear a plot point, and then like halfway through the book or maybe somewhere down the line, it's dropped, and you don't know what happened to it, and you're kind of confused, and you're just like, but nobody mentioned that plot point again, and that seems like that would be important. And then the characters aren't really there, and it's so important for me as a reader. Like I want to feel the tension between the characters, and I want to remember them because they're the reason I read. They're the reason I read
Exactly.
the book. Like I want to fall in love with them just as much as they're falling in love with each other. So
Exactly.
I think that's like such a great way that you kind of look at it when you're starting a new subgenre. When writing, do you stay focused on one book at a time? Or do you have like several books in some stage of drafting? Like with so many books, it seems like such a quick turnaround and like just lots of plot points going on.
There's usually 5 or 6 books that I call like the ruminating books, where they're kind of tumbling around like a washing machine in my head. And I'm like, okay, they're still kind of in process. I'm thinking them through. They're probably next up in the queue, or they may be a year or two away, but I've got some good ideas on them, and I want to kind of let those ideas play out in my head so I can be prepared to write them down. And as you get older, when you're a writer, and older, I mean just in the craft, you learn to go, okay, I can't write this book right now, but I have a bunch of good ideas. So I'm going to put it all down on paper. And then later, even if it's 2 years, you pick up that paper again, you go, okay, after a minute, I can jump right back into where this was. And that's like a really important skill that I developed because it keeps me being able to move through multiple projects quickly and not have writer's block or get upset because I've got to write this story for this project or group box set or whatever. But meanwhile, I secretly really want to write something else. You have to kind of learn to, I like put on your big girl pants. You got to learn how to, separate your time and manage everything. And so I always have the books in my head. And then I have the one book that I'm physically handwriting and dictating. And then I have the next book that is in the hands of the editor and eventually the copy editor. So there's always something writing, something edited, and then there's something that I'm just releasing. So something new that's coming out. So it's kind of like this cycle. I move in a cycle, but it looks like I'm doing 3 things at once, but I'm technically not so much. I tend to finish the book, get it to the editor, and then while he's editing, I'm usually quickly releasing one book that just came out, and then a week or two later, I go right back to editing while he's still, or right back to writing while he's still editing. So it's kind of this process where it's just a circle going around and around.
Well, and I like how you structure yourself out because that's always what gets me is because I do, I think we all as writers get like the little nagging of the new book idea. And then
yes, the shiny bright idea.
Yes, yes. And it seems like so much fun that they demand to be written right now at this very instant. And you're already like halfway through another book. And I know that's what I struggle with. And I'm working on how to structure myself out. Like you say, you have like you work in a cycle to where I can just finish the book and then work on that next idea as opposed to trying to do all the things all at once, because that's kind of where I kind of end up like digging myself into a hole basically. And I'm trying to and I know some writers can do that, but other writers too want to learn okay, how do I kind of get myself on some type of, like you said, a cycle to where I can focus on one. It's editing, so I'm writing the next one, because that's what I've always heard with authors who do a lot of releases. They'll write, and while it's with editing, they're working on the very next one.
And I like I said, that's a learned skill. So I don't know any writer that just naturally was like, oh, I'm so smart and I do it this way. Like everyone starts at that stage where you're like, I have 20 ideas. What do I write for first? What about this character? What about this scene? What about, And so one of the things I used to do was write scenes out of order. And that was also a problem. So now I have a strict policy that I write everything chronologically, start to finish. Even if I know, if I have a good line, I may write down a good line, but I never let myself write a scene in advance. And that is part of the process. It keeps me from jumping. It keeps me focused by staying in chronological order. And I found that that was a way to trick my brain into not running off into the sunset with a new idea. And then it also trained me on pacing, because what I learned as a young writer was if you're skipping scenes, it's because the scenes you're skipping are not interesting. So they probably shouldn't be in the book. Now, there's always been those rare scenes where you're like, I really don't want to write this, but it does need to be in there, but let's make it as painless as possible. There are those scenes. But if like half of your book, you're just jumping back and forth, what that tells you is that you're having trouble figuring out what scenes are relevant and how to get you from A to B without all these extra scenes in the middle that you think you have to write that you probably don't have to write. Because I know a lot of writers write what's called telegraphing scenes, where you have somebody that's got to drive to the grocery store and nothing happens between the character's house and the grocery store. And there's not even internal monologue or something like that. And they're just going along and they're talking about the drive. And I'm like, just get them to the grocery store. Next paragraph. When they parked in the lock of the grocery store, they're walking in. Like, just skip all that stuff. No wonder it's boring. Readers don't want to read it. You don't want to write it, So you kind of learn these little tricks of like, I always heard the joke that one of my older writer friends said. She goes, write like a reader. So in other words, if you don't want to read it, don't write it. And I thought that's such good advice.
That is good advice, and I kind of came from a background where I wrote several screenplays because I was doing a lot of screenwriting for a while. And they always told us, like, never put anything in there that isn't doing something for the scene. Like it's either doing something for the characters. You're either it's either a character study, or it's something about the world building, or something about the plot, or it's serving the story in some way. So those are the things that need to be in there. So with several series and subgenres, how do you determine which book to work on next? I know you kind of touched on it a little bit when you said you switched subgenres because that's the way your brain kind of works.
I haven't been very good about this in the last couple of years because I had a lot of project commitments for other authors where I agreed to be in various sets. And I've loved all those stories, but it kept me away from my original plan of rotating my intellectual property crops better, as I like to say. But I really try to go, okay, let's do one book in one series, and then the next book will be from a different series. And then I do prioritize books that I think will make a little more money, because some books I write and I'm like, this is an amazing story, but it's going to be longer to find an audience for it. So when I do that, I know that I've got to write other books either at the same time or around it to be able to publish books that can generate livable income. So when I was writing my romantic historical fiction, which is probably one of the best books I've ever written, it was 169,000 words. It was basically two stories in one, because there were two main characters that each had love stories and sub-love stories of the people that they matched during the war, because they were matchmakers. And so there was this incredible pressure that I thought, I have got to write a paranormal and I've got to write a historical on either side of this research and writing process for this historical World War II fiction, because if I don't, I'm going to go too long without proper releases and I'll lose my audience, I'll lose my income. And so there was like financial pressure there. But at the same time, I also wanted to write this book that I knew was going to be an incredible book. And so I had to kind of reframe my schedule that way too. So I always look at it as, okay, make sure I release one book a year from my most popular series, and then try to get at least one book a year from the series that I've not done the best on writing. So like I had a book series that for 3 years didn't have anything come out. And I'm like, oh, I need to get another book out from this series. So I prioritized getting a novella out this past year for that series. So to just kind of help it. So you don't ever want a series to fall behind, but you always want to make sure you have a good, strong leader from that other series come out too.
I love that you look at it so strategically, because that was something that I've heard too from other authors. I've heard so many times. It's like, listen, if you wait too long to put out another book in the series, you'll lose readers.
You do.
Yeah. And that's an inevitability if you're not writing to make sure that you get if you lead them on with a series and say there's another book coming out and it takes you a long, long time to put that out. And I know that's actually how I structure, believe it or not. I love you mention it because that's how I structure my podcast is like, that's how I determine a lot of times, like what episodes I put out. Like, surprisingly, the cozy mystery did amazingly well that episode. So like,
That's awesome.
I guess I'm coming out with another cozy mystery episode. So like, I got one in the queue kind of waiting, but like, for another interview. But it was like one of those things where you said, like, you have to, give the readers what they want, right?
Exactly.
I will say that I kind of whip through romance books really quickly. So I love when like a writer has like something already in the catalog that I know I can just kind of binge. And since you have like so many books, what is a great place for readers to start?
Well, I would say that Wicked Designs, which is the first book in my League of Rogues series, is free on Amazon. It may also be free on the other platforms. If it's not, you can also sign up for my newsletter and get it completely free that way if you don't read on Amazon. And then, but it's available, like I said, on all platforms and audio as well. And then the other one that's currently free is Grigori, a Royal Dragon romance. That's a sexy dragon shifter. He's a boardroom badass Russian guy that, kidnaps his mate when she's like looking up forbidden books in a Russian library. It's very exciting and fun. So he's the first book in that series as well, and that's free too. So I'd recommend those. That would get you started on historical and paranormal. And then I'm getting ready to re-release a really, really amazing contemporary romance series soon. They're not up for sale yet. The old publisher books are still up, but hopefully in the next month or so, the Gilded Cuff, which is the first book in the series, will be 99 cents. And you'll know it's the right book because it'll be 99 cents and it'll have a gorgeous guy on the cover rather than a picture of a piece of jewelry. So be on the lookout for that. Feel free to sign up for my newsletter now because I'll announce that when it comes out. And that first book will be 99 cents. And it's delicious. It's reclusive billionaire who doesn't want to talk to anyone, and a reporter who thinks she needs to save his life because she knows something about his past, and so she has to bargain her way into his world, and it's very, very delicious.
Oh, that sounds tantalizing and like hitting all the tropes that I like.
Oh yeah.
So where can listeners find your books and how can they connect with you?
The easiest way is just to go to www.laurensmithbooks.com, and Lauren is spelled Lauren, like Ralph Lauren, or the designer. And I have all my links on there. I provide audio, paperbacks, and ebooks, and the ebooks are all available on Kindle, Apple, Kobo, Barnes and Noble, Nook, and Google. And also I provide my ebooks to libraries via Overdrive, Hoopla, those kind of apps. So if you're on a limited budget, and I know a lot of people prefer KU, but I can't do KU because it doesn't pay enough. So I make sure all my books are available in libraries so you can get the digital books very easily that way. So, and then I'm on social media, so you can get all my social media links from my website as well.